I'm Al McFarlane. Welcome to Conversations with Al McFarlane. Glad to be here and glad to have you along. Got a great program today, starting off with my guest, Angela Rose Myers. Angela, how are you? Good to see you. It's been a while, and thank you so much for joining the program.
Thank you for having me. I'm doing well. I'm doing well. I'm in the middle of finals week for me, for my graduate studies. So I'm busy.
Got it, got it, got it. I connected with you in part because I'm a fan of your mom and your dad. Um uh, both leaders, elders, powerful and wonderful people. And I'm a fan of you as a young person who's providing service and leadership to the community, your work with the NAACP and other arenas as well. I'm going to give you a second and ask you to introduce yourself so that people who are watching or listening get a sense of your vision and your work in community.
Oh, thank you so much. Hello, everyone. My name is Angela Rose Myers. I am the current president of the Minneapolis NAACP, and I will be until the end of this month. And then I will be the co chair for the Political Action Committee for the branch. So, the Minneapolis NAACP is a volunteer organization. And we have so many opportunities for folks in the community to step up to volunteer in leadership capacities. And so I'm so excited for the future of the branch. And then for me personally, I'm a graduate student. So I'm getting my master's in human rights at the University of Minnesota. And I'm in my first year of a 2-year program there. And so I'm really excited and happy to be with you. I was recently on a panel with they were talking about like the history of the Twin Cities, and I was
Hmm.
thinking about how particularly the Black history of the Twin Cities is so held and cherished within Black media, and so I'm just so grateful to see the legacy of Black media grow and extend as we go into the future. So thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you for the comment. Let me say that not only are we streaming live to the McFarlane Media platforms here in Minnesota, but we're connected through my affiliation with the Black Press of America, the National Newspaper Publishers Association, with Black Press USA Facebook webpage and YouTube channel. So we're connecting. And in that spirit, let me introduce another guest for today's program. He and I were on this morning at 6 o'clock, 6:30. On Let It Be Told, I think is the name of the program. Brother James Wright is joining us from Washington, D.C. He's a reporter with the Washington Informer, and he's a regular participant in the Morning Daily Show, a news program that's excellent, that looks at issues around the country, around the world, updates, all from a perspective of our community. And so when you talk about, Angela, the Black press, we represent that. Uh, the paper he represents, the market he's in, one of the oldest markets for Black press, Black media in the country, and they're holding it down. Brother James, good to see you again. How are you?
Good afternoon. Good to see you again. And good to finally meet you, Angela Rose Myers.
Well, this morning we talked about yesterday's announcement that former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin was pleading guilty in federal court to depriving George Floyd and a minor victim of their constitutional rights. That guilty plea means that Chauvin is going to be looking at a sentence by the federal court. And I understand that the sentence is going to be something like 240 months. So that's about 20 years, I think. Maybe it's a little bit more than that. Uh, but let's talk about that. Let's talk about the sentence and the what we believe are the motivating factors of him accepting a federal plea, federal deal. He was charged by the federal government with hate crimes following his conviction for the second degree murder and third degree murder uh, charges brought by the state of Minnesota, and prosecutions led by our Attorney General, Keith Ellison of great renown, former congressman himself. So now the second shoe has dropped on Derek Chauvin. this shoe is the consequence, the charges, and his acceptance of those charges leveled by the federal court. What's your take on it, James Wright?
Well, let me just say that Derek Chauvin's defense lawyers did a pretty good job, because that is their job, to try to defend him to the best of their ability and to make sure he gets as little time as possible. Many of us were surprised that he did plead guilty to civil rights charges in terms of George Floyd. Many of us thought that he was going to actually fight those charges, if not from the belief that deep down inside, I and a lot of other people think that really Derek Chauvin didn't think he did anything wrong. Anyway, we're now looking at a fact that he may do some time in a federal prison. And as we were saying this morning, I'm going to stress that again, that there is a common belief here around this country that if you do time in a federal facility, it'll be much easier than doing it in a state facility. I guess they believe because it's a federal facility, the people are more sophisticated and the crimes are more sophisticated, and they do have those minimum security facilities, some known as country clubs. And I think that deep in his mind, he thinks he's going to go to one of these country club facilities. He is not. So therefore, it's important to understand that Derek Chauvin is going to do time. And as he does time, he can reflect on what the wrong that he did. But right now, Brother Al, he doesn't really think he did anything wrong, but he just decided to take the civil rights plea because his defense attorneys came up with such a good deal for him.
Angela, let me ask you to jump in for a couple of things. One, as a leader in the civil rights movement here in Minneapolis, but also as an activist, a young person. And I have to give credit to the energy that young people brought, and young Black women in particular brought, to creating this global awareness. Number one, the fearlessness of the young woman who, as witness to the event, the unfolding of a murder, had the grit and the focus and the ability to stay and film and live stream this egregious event. So kudos to her, but I think she's part of a cohort of young people that I see you being part of as well, people that were raised with a different understanding, a certain fearlessness. So I'm going to ask you to give your personal take on not only the guilty plea yesterday, but the entire process. What's been happening in our community around what we're calling the reckoning associated with the George Floyd murder and trial, and now this federal trial as well?
Well, I actually think that our cohort of young activists have definitely been learning. We've learned a lot from our ancestors and our elders, even thinking back to the abolition movement at the end of slavery. It was folks like Frederick Douglass who was telling their narrative and trying to get out their narrative no matter what, by any means that they had available to them. And so even thinking about during the Reconstruction era and the beginning of Jim Crow, you had pioneers and trailblazers like Ida B. Wells, who detailed the lynchings in the South in extreme detail, going into story by story, narrative by narrative, how innocent Black men were being accused of particularly raping white women. But also there was some Black men who weren't even accused of anything, any crimes, and even instances where they were found innocent of their crimes and mobs would come and lynch them, and not in the cover of darkness, but on Sunday afternoon after church, right? And that was the legacy of Ida B. Wells taking the red record and detailing this for an international audience. And then you have even in the civil rights era, right in that moment when the UN was formed, you had the NAACP doing an appeal to the world, documenting Jim Crow and how Jim Crow has impacted Black Americans. And then you had even We Charge Genocide, one of the first petitions to the UN, where Black activists in the Civil Rights Congress charged, and W.E.B. Du Bois charged to the UN that Black Americans were the victims of a genocide. And a genocide is a systemic killing off of not just peoples, but our culture. And so, that was some of the things that I feel like our cohort now and our age right now, we're getting back to that radical, that very, very real, fierce calling upon and saying, this is not just what's happening, but what is happening is morally unjust. Right. And so with the trial of George Floyd, we weren't sure what the outcomes of the trial of Derek Chauvin for the murder of George Floyd, when we weren't sure what the outcomes were initially going to be, one of the things that I heard so often was, we all saw a murder. Now, if you're going to fight with me on Facebook comments about whether it was a murder or not because of our legal system determining it was a murder or not, what I saw was a murder. What I saw was morally wrong, morally irreprehensible. What I saw was a violation of George Floyd's human rights, right? And so if our law and our legal system does not catch up and did not determine that, then we would have to change that legal system. But I think what our age right now is that people are very morally grounded, and they're very outspoken when it comes to policies and laws, because we recognize that just because it's a law, just because it is a system, doesn't mean it was right. Slavery was legal, right? And so we changed slavery. Jim Crow was legal, and so we changed Jim Crow. And so we have to be morally grounded, and we have to be outspoken and using whatever tools we have to pull on the international and then the local as well heartstrings, so that we can really use people power to change these institutions. And we can never be in a space where we're putting institutions over people. Institutions were created by people, okay? And they have oppressed us, particularly the US government, and Minnesota particularly, which I believe was founded on the genocide of the Dakota people in Minnesota. For the history of Minnesota, there was, a war, the Dakota Wars, and there was mass lynchings of Native people in Minnesota, as well as harassment and the terrorization of Black people in the late 1800s in this state. And that's what created a white state, where in 2000 it was 89% white. Now we're down to 76% white, and people going, people are scared, right? But the thing is that you don't create a fully white state without white supremacy and without normalizing white supremacy. And so what we are doing now is we are calling out what has been normalized as saying this is morally wrong. And what we are going to do is we are going to create a future of laws, of policies, of institutions that are center us and center people instead of centering white supremacy.
You said a mouthful, Angela. Thank you for stretching out there. One of the things we discussed this morning on the show, James, was the image of Minnesota, the perception that this is a very liberal and freedom-leaning community, and one that supports opportunity for Black and Brown people. You have, Angela, thoroughly debunked that with the history lesson. Thank you so much. Talk, though, specifically about this verdict. What you think, what your impressions are associated with the guilty verdict in the federal court by Derek Chauvin yesterday.
I think this is probably more of a reckoning with him and the his defense in the legal system. One of the things that I think about actually when I heard this was how he actually had wanted to plead on the federal level, but William Barr under the Trump administration had pushed back his plea. This was something that came out around last year. The New York Times, I remember, had an article on it. And I really want to amplify what Mr. Wright had said earlier with this understanding that what Derek Chauvin wanted to do was be in the federal prisons. He didn't want to be in the state prisons, particularly not amongst people that he probably abused and put in jail as well. And so one of the things I think about when I think about how he has pled guilty to to harming the civil rights and the American rights of two Black individuals, I think about how probably there are some motives on his side to do that. But also I think about how just in history, how this is really a unique moment. I don't know really any cases where, Black American civil rights someone has been pled guilty on saying that they have violated Black American civil rights while they were doing their quote unquote job. This is what he said when he was, on trial, right? Derek Chauvin doing his job of policing. And so I think that's very a unique moment, but I don't think that this is the end all be all for justice, right? I think that we have to reckon with the fact that Derek Chauvin has murdered George Floyd. And him pleading guilty on taking away George Floyd's rights will not bring back George, but this is a solidification of the fact that Black Americans do have these rights as precedents, right? So that's just some of the things that I think about. This is a very legalese, this is a little bit further away from like the layman person on the street. But I do think it's a reckoning of him with acknowledging what he has done. And, I actually really hold out hope that all, particularly white Americans and white police officers who have done similar things that Derek Chauvin has done will have a similar reckoning with the fact that what they have done is illegal. It's illegal. And it is morally unjust as well. Whether they believe it or not, that's that part. But it also in our laws is illegal.
Al, may I make a point?
Go ahead, James.
And you and Angela in Minneapolis, and you have to understand that on a national level, Minnesota has a reputation as a liberal state. Minnesota is the state of Hubert Humphrey. Minnesota is the state of Walter Mondale, and of more recent, Minnesota is the state of Paul Wellstone. And you just mentioned the fact that Keith Ellison represented the Minneapolis area in Congress, and you now have a Somali American of all things representing you in the Congress. So there is a real strong belief around this country that Minneapolis and Minnesota is a liberal state. So this is why some people were quietly shocked when they found out about Derek Chauvin killing George Floyd that way. Because, I mean, we can expect that in Mississippi, we can expect that in Georgia, but not in Minnesota. So, and this is what makes this dynamic so interesting. And as I listen to both of you all talk, those of you from Minneapolis talk about this, it just like opens an eyes for people like me and a lot of people around the country about what the real Minneapolis is like.
It's liberal. It's a liberal. I would say it's a liberal state, but liberal doesn't negate racism. So you got white progressive.
Am I gonna get a chance to speak, Al?
Yes, you are. Just one second.
I'll go for it. Go ahead, but that's just liberal does not negate racist.
Well, let me bring in Clinton Collins, our attorney. Clinton Collins is a corporate counsel for Geico here in Twin Cities, but one of the originators of this conversation on Thursday between several of us, and Clinton, good to see you again. Anxious as an attorney to get us listening to you as an attorney to get your take on what happened yesterday with the guilty plea by Derek Chauvin. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think Derek Chauvin just realized that after what happened in the state case, that the federal case was going to go the same way, and he wanted closure. And because Keith Ellison and Jerry Blackwell had done such an excellent job on the state case, all the feds had to do in terms of the facts was just to replicate what they had already done. Now, the federal civil rights charges are a little bit different. The history of a 1983 action, which is the technical name for the federal case, stems back from Reconstruction, in which you had people in the Klan and other white terrorist groups who were often in the police force as well, or in law enforcement, and they would use their quasi-legal status in law enforcement to scare the crap out of Black people. And so the whole premise of 1983 action is that you act under the color of law, meaning that you use your quasi or sometimes official legal status to deprive people of their civil rights, which is exactly what Derek Chauvin did. He was a police officer, so he had the legal authority to arrest and even to kill people under certain circumstances, but you can't do that in a unfair, discriminatory manner. In other words, if you're going to kill somebody, you better have a damn good reason to do it. You just can't do it because of the color of their skin or because of their gender, or there's a whole series of categories. And so what Chauvin was looking at, if he had gone to trial in the federal system and lost, which he would have been in prison the rest of his life. He likely will die in prison anyway, because prison is hard on people. And if you're over the age of 50, or I think it's 50 in the prison system, you're considered elderly because it's a hard place to be. And so what Chauvin said is, look, I already have this federal or state time. If the feds prosecute me, they're not going to cut me any slack. There'll be no possibility of parole, and I will absolutely die in prison. Whereas one important concession he got was that his time is being served concurrently. In other words, it's not like he's going to do all the state time and then do the federal time. They're being run at the same time, which actually was a pretty significant break for him. And I'm sure that was a very powerful incentive to go ahead and settle. Because again, if he had gone to trial in the federal system and lost, then he would have saved the state time first. And then if he was still alive, then the federal time, which would have been 25, 30, 40 years. I don't know the exact length of time. He would have definitely have died in prison.
What do you make of the fact that the federal charges he pled guilty to included pleading guilty to willfully depriving while acting under color of law a then 14-year-old juvenile of his constitutional rights, resulting in the juvenile's bodily injury? I'm reading from the story. And what I'm thinking about that, Clinton, is that this is one additional item that the court was bringing, the prosecutors were bringing to Chauvin. There may have been more. More could have come. And maybe Chauvin saw the writing on the wall and said,
no, absolutely, Al, you're absolutely right. And I think that what the court was doing, both the state as well as the federal settlement, is showing their absolute disgust with Chauvin's behavior and the history of police brutality in this country. They were sending a very clear message that this crap has gone on forever, and we are going to not only hold people to account, we're going to give them the maximum penalty, because we're not only punishing people now, we're punishing all those people who for the hundreds of years have pulled the same kinds of bull crap.
I think we
Absolutely
lost him.
sending a message. And I agree with Ms. Myers that you cannot restore the rights of people who were trampled for hundreds of years, but at least you can draw a clear line in the sand and say, this bullshit is going to stop right now. and we're going to start holding people accountable. And if that means that some people have to eat more of a poop sandwich than they should have, that's because for too long, white people got away eating roast beef sandwiches while we had to eat poop. Well, guess what? Payback's a bitch.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, you heard James Wright. He's a reporter from the Washington Informer, one of my colleague newspapers and member of the NNPA, a great newspaper, talk about the perception of Minnesota. And he said that the world's image, the country's image of Minnesota, is that this is a bastion of liberality, of progressiveness, and that things are quite good here for Black people. I said when he and I were on the show this morning, nay, not so. Hold your horses, because we've got this history of discrepancies and disparities that is absolutely hurtful. Clinton, you are muted. Unmute. You have to unmute you, Clinton. Clinton, you still unmuted. You still on mute. I see we're joined by Dr. Irma McFarlane. Dr. Irma McFarlane is the Education and Culture Editor for Insight News. She's the namesake of the Irma McFarlane Archive at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, a former college dean, former director of the Urban Research Outreach and was it Communications Center? Engagement Center here in Minnesota, and just a great writer and a great friend. Irma, thank you for joining the call.
Thank you.
Jump in. What's your? I also want to make sure that you talk about bell hooks before you get off the call today, because it's important to acknowledge here you've written something about here. But what about your impressions on yesterday's announcement about Derek Chauvin pleading guilty to federal charges about the victimizing and denying the constitutional rights of George Floyd and a minor victim? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think that he had no choice. Once the feds got into it, then it's inescapable. And I think that's the kind of public attention and national attention that we have to bring to these issues. Nothing happens until it becomes more of a federal issue, as opposed to a state or a city or a local issue. And so I'm surprised that he chose to plead guilty, but I'm pleased. And I must say, in reading the material, I was horrified to find that he had done the same thing to a 14-year-old boy. I mean, that to me was, as bad as what happened to George Floyd. And this young man now has to live with that trauma. So it does say that there is a little bit of justice that is happening in this world. I don't know how widespread it is, but at least something has happened, as opposed to us continuously in other states getting these charges. Getting these charges of people being found innocent of things. So it's like we win some, we lose some, and hopefully we're moving forward as opposed to going backwards.
When I read what you're talking about, the story mentioning the 14-year-old that Chauvin had also held with his knee in his neck, 15 minutes, it's almost as if Chauvin had been practicing, that he had practice in this art of detention that led to the murder of George Floyd. What I also know is that there were at least 16 or 17 allegations of police brutality against Chauvin in his career that never rose to the public eye. They're in the record, but they didn't require or get reprimand or public notice by the department, but they exist. And so I was telling Clinton Collins, maybe if he had gone to a full trial in the federal government, all of those allegations would have surfaced and been part of and led to, as Clinton Collins said, the inescapable conclusion that he would have a life in prison sentence without possibility of parole. now he's dodged that bullet.
Well,
Angela,
also
jump in.
MPD has dodged that bullet, because then when you have an officer who has, upwards of over a dozen instances of real abuse and real, misuse of force, then the question really turns not just to the officer, but also the employer, and then also the state of Minnesota that gives out licenses for peace officers. And at what point are we going to go to the post board, which I'm actually doing now, but getting public scrutiny to the post board, the Police Officer Standards and Training Board, to say, when you have an officer that has over a dozen instances of abuse like this, it's time to revoke their license. So.
And
The question-
I think,
Go
to
ahead.
your point, if this were any other occupation that required some level of expertise and leadership, and we found those numbers of allegations, one, why did they let him get away with it, as you pointed out? Two, who is accountable? It's not just the individual that's accountable. So pleading to the lesser charged, as you say, Al, he dodged a big bullet. He dodged a life sentence potentially, and other victims coming forward and making allegations. And that may still happen. Hopefully people who were brutalized by him will come forward and raise additional allegations so that we can hold the state accountable, the police department accountable, for this as well. He's not alone.
The brother of George Floyd, according to the report that's in our paper, said that Brandon Williams lamented again that Chauvin had 9 minutes and 29 seconds to understand what he was doing and to stop kneeling, but he chose not to. He called the guy a monster and said he should have been arrested in 2017 in reference to the charges that were finally leveled and won by the federal government in the case of the 14-year-old juvenile. That story is, as you said, Irma McFarlane, gripping. What I understand from the documents is that a domestic abuse situation led to the call of the Minneapolis police. The child's mother said she was being abused by her son. When officers arrived, the officers included Derek Chauvin. They found the child, the 14-year-old, in his room, lying on the floor, playing with his telephone. And when they challenged him, they lifted him up. Chauvin lifted him up and had him by his neck up against the wall. And then the story goes on to describe then that the child was placed on the ground, face down, and Chauvin had him in the same position that he had George Floyd in, knee to the back and knee to the neck, and that he held that child in that position for about 15 minutes. And sometime in that exchange, he also was using deadly force. He used his police flashlight. You all can imagine that, and pummeled or struck the young man in the head, causing damage that I'm presuming the child suffers from today. So I looked at that as practice. That's how it looks to me now, that he practiced, and he simply probably has done this more times than we know. We cannot know. Well, I don't know anyway, but it's frightening to me. And what's important now, I think Clinton said this, and I think we're all saying this, is that the country has to acknowledge that these things are not uncommon. They're not one of. This is part of the ecosystem that we have struggled with and against, and that our struggle has not ended even today. And that even though, as James Wright was saying, this community, Minnesota, St. Paul, Minneapolis, has a reputation of being a place that's friendly to Black people, somehow, Angela, we have to figure out a way to tell the truth. And to get the truth out, not only about the history, the past, and the present obstacles to opportunity and development, the systemic barriers to opportunity for our people, but we have to retrain ourselves to stay focused on the fight, to ensure that if we don't fight for justice, justice will not occur. That's what I think. Angela, feedback? Dr. Irma, what do you think?
Well, let me say something real quick.
James, go
In
ahead.
terms of systemic racism in Minneapolis and Minnesota, one of the byproducts of systemic racism is this thing called the blue wall of silence that is instituted in many, if not all, police departments. This is basically where police officers can get away with committing all types of crimes against people, particularly people of color, and no one says anything because there's a brotherhood among these police officers not to rat on your fellow brother police officer. This has got to be broken. This blue wall needs to be tumbling down. And we have got to make sure that our lawmakers understand that. We've got to make sure that judges understand that anything having to do with this blue wall of silence, which Derek Chauvin benefited from for years, has to be brought down.
I definitely agree. I think that Minneapolis and Hennepin County right now is in a time of great transition. And I hope that it leads to major transformation for the better. I'm going to lay out just a number of issues that we're currently facing right now. The police chief, Chief Arredondo, has stepped down. We currently have an interim chief. So we don't currently have a future vision when it comes to what MPD is going to be doing. Particularly, the mayor's office has created a public safety transition team, which I do sit on, that will craft what a version of public safety might look like and give recommendations to the mayor's office. And then also we have a Hennepin County sheriff who is being currently investigated for a DWI, driving while intoxicated, in a state vehicle in Alexandria, Minnesota. We are currently, going through the trial of Kim Potter, who is the officer involved in the killing of Dante Wright. And so right now we have a lot of obstacles, right? We have a third of the police department has left the MPD. Many police departments in the suburbs and the county sheriff's office, Metro Transit, they are struggling to fill positions. And these seem to be obstacles where at one moment, like in North Minneapolis, you might only have a handful. I've even heard the number as low as 4 officers patrolling at a time, right? For an area and a neighborhood of thousands of people with potentials for 911 calls to be in the hundreds, right? And so we really are facing a lot of obstacles, but that doesn't mean that this is not an opportunity for transformation. When you have also the open negotiations for the police contract, the police union contract, they have not renewed since the negotiations fell apart in 2019. So these are all opportunities, I believe, for real change and real reforms. It is just how we utilize this moment to be outspoken, to actually talk about these problems, and to actually push for real systemic change that we want to see, and not just falling for the okie doke, falling for, okay, what we need is just more 911 folk or something like that. No, we actually need some real transformation that has to maybe be even ground up. So, we are facing a lot of obstacles, but when you have a third of the officers that have left, look, we have a requirement for how many officers we have to hire. Now let's look into what hiring looks like, because you can change the dynamics and really quickly. Then you have a sheriff that is stepping down, or not a sheriff, a police chief that is stepped down. Now you have an opportunity to say, okay, what worked and what did not work, and what in the vision. And for me, I really bought into the vision of Chief Arredondo's vision. But also we have to recognize that him being a Black man at the top isolated him as well. And so, right now we need to see what our future is going to look like. And we have that opportunity.
Take a minute, Angela, and talk about the sides for the sake of James and others around the country, the sides of the debate about defund the police. Minneapolis, again, ground zero in a national discussion, a creation of this important debate on what policing should look like. The question of community activists, I'd say your cohort group, was how do we reimagine what policing is? So how did that come out? Explain that from your point of view.
I think that it really came out of the abolition movement. You had folks like Angela Davis who were talking about, and along for the last decade, a lot of folks who have been focused on prison abolition. And with the murder of Black folk, people are also looking at, how police officers have implicit bias, but that implicit bias doesn't just translate or manifest in, more numbers of Black people being stopped, right? Or it does not just the manifestation, it also manifests in Black people being murdered by the police. And so when the murder of George Floyd happened, you did have groups and city council folk who, did make a bold stance to defund the police, as saying that if we are paying for this service, we should not be on the other end of being fearful of the service that we are paying for. And so you had a charter amendment. And so the Minneapolis charter is unique in the country, as it's one of the only charters that mandates a minimum police officers per citizen. And also the structure of the police department and the charter. And so what they had wanted to do was take out actually most of the mandates of having a police department, and then also that minimum number of police officers. And they wanted to actually create a Department of Public Safety in the city charter. And in that Department of Public Safety, you could have, if necessary, police officers. So this was, I think, more of a policy, government, bureaucracy way of saying, if you don't want to fund the police, but we need funding for public safety, you could fund public safety without funding the police. Currently, as the city stands, a lot of the programs that people like the mental health specialists, these programs that interface with officers and community members, it is officers and community members that are doing that. So if you, with the idea even of the history of the Office of Violence Prevention, where the Office of Violence Prevention is not under the police department, but they deal with community violence and things like that. People like those programs and they want to fund those programs. But unfortunately, a lot of the programs actually are under the police. So you would, and when the police funding goes down, those are the first programs that are cut. And so I think they were, really trying to build that structure. Unfortunately, a lot of the conversation came under, do we want police officers right now in a moment where, there is an increase, there's a real increase in community crime. There is a real increase in gun violence happening. How do we address that right now? And we want police officers to do that. And then also, how do we change a police reform? And so that was, unfortunately, the conversation had got boiled down to abolish the police or don't abolish the police. Vote yes, vote no on this. And when you boil a nuanced conversation like that down, a lot of the momentum actually got sucked out of the room. Right. So it became hyper focused on messaging instead of hyper focused on solutions. Yeah. And in that moment, too, even if that charter amendment had passed, we would have still had a police department. Right. And we would have still had the potential for police brutality. And so the real issues of police brutality weren't going to be addressed. Maybe funding would have been addressed. Maybe who is over who and who talks to who would have been addressed. But the issue of police brutality would not have been addressed, and it's still not addressed. And that's why we needed to stay solution focused on the problem instead of, message focused.
Let me introduce my friend and colleague, Kamal King. Kamal King is a retired attorney, worked with Coca-Cola in Atlanta. He's calling from Atlanta, is regular on this program. Kamal, good to see you.
Thank you. Good to be seen. And this is a very interesting conversation. I've learned a lot, but this whole thing about Minnesota nice is we've all agreed that that's not the case, And I want to say thank you for sending this plea agreement.
Mhm.
And I was reading it, and I see that I think it's on page 3. It's on page 3 where the policy, the Minnesota Police Department had a policy in place for their police officers that regardless, it says the defendant was also familiar with MPD policy requiring officers to intervene regardless of their rank or seniority if they observed another officer using inappropriate force. That was policy. So I'm assuming that's what they're going to go against the other 3 officers on.
Because the document also says that Chauvin says at no time did he hear or see intervention from the other officers. So that's clearly in there.
Correct. The other thing I think that goes to the heart of the whole police matter nationally is this protection that police officers receive, when they're acting under color of law, that they, even though they may break the law, they cannot be sued individually. And I remember when one of the civil rights bills, the discrimination bill, was being considered back in the 70s, job discrimination. And at that time, was it the Democrats? At that time, there was a section of the legislators who insisted that even in job discrimination, that the provision that would allow individuals to be sued, because a lot of times, most of the times, there are people that you can identify who are breaking these laws, but they are shielded from suit the same way police are shielded from suit, from being sued. And so I think that those 2 things really need to, that particular thing really needs to be looked at and carved down a bit.
Irma, comments?
I would just add that in addition to looking at, I think this is an ongoing conversation. And I think what Angela said is that this is not the time because certain things didn't pass to stop, but to remain vigilant and to focus on solutions. And I think one of those areas that needs to be looked at is not just the police training in the academy, looking at whether or not officers know the law, also looking at whether the officers who are patrolling communities actually come from those communities or are living disconnected in suburbs in which they have no contact or interaction with people. We also need to look at the curriculum. Many police officers get their college degree and they go for a degree in criminal justice. We need to look at that criminal justice curriculum because often it is predicated on a deficit model in which it always looks at the people who are so-called criminals in a very negative way. It doesn't look at context. It doesn't look at what motivates people. And so I think that by changing some of that curriculum, we may be able to get to police officers before they even get to the academy. So that's something to also take into account.
James, comments, thoughts, feedback? And you're muted, James. Unmute.
I'm sorry. Let me piggyback on something Dr. Irma said and Angela said. In terms of what Dr. Irma said, in Washington, D.C., only 16% of officers, D.C. officers, live in the city. Only 16%.
Mm-hmm.
And how can you build a relationship with people that you're policing when you live out in Virginia, you live out in far Maryland, and good Lord, you even live in West Virginia or even Pennsylvania? That makes no sense at all, but that's just how things are in the District of Columbia. Angela talked quite well about defund the police. On a national level, that's being used by the conservatives to say no police, or these socialists, so-called socialists, want to run wild and have no police department and have no criminal protection. And but that is not what we're saying. Also, on the local level, in terms of defund the police, we do have a robust progressive community here in DC, which is largely Black. And what they're saying is, and their message is being screwed up by the mainstream media. What they're saying in defund the police is to take funds away from the police budget and allocate it to social services, to our Department of Employment Services, to help people get jobs instead of just buying tanks, buying rockets in order to hurt people.
So what they're really
the
saying is
conversations that's happening in Minneapolis is,
demilitarized. They're saying
yeah,
demilitarize the police,
that's
not
right,
defund.
sir.
Yeah. Mm.
That's right,
And
sir.
I
So
think,
the conversations that y'all are having are the same ones we're having here in DC.
but I think what we have to do is change the language. If people appropriate the sound bites that you have, then you got to get savvy and change the sound bites. So we need to talk about reimagining and demilitarizing as opposed to defunding. That's like a showstopper. So why keep up with it? Change the language, change the messaging. You know, that's what marketing is for.
While we have these structures like the Office of Violence Prevention, who's run by a Black woman, Sasha Cotton, who has done an amazing job. And if you put the numbers, you know, just of what the Office of Violence Prevention, the services that they provide, from helping people who have been in the hospital and saying, how did you get to the hospital? What happened? And then saying, well, what follow-up care do you need so that you are not harmed again? And then so you do not harm others. And then they have, you know, a multitude of youth programs and programs that protect our community. They are getting $6 million, whereas the MPD gets around $91 million a year. And so, you know, just seeing how the things that community wants and wants to see more of, and it's a shame that like the Office of Violence Prevention is not funded to the capacity that it should be, whereas another department, and this could be any department that is ineffective in decreasing crime, because we have actually seen an increase in crime, and ineffective in keeping Black people who they have pledged to serve safe. You know, any department, if you're talking about, you know, the school system, which we should be talking about the school systems too, but, you know, or child protective service, anything like that. If you hold up, why are they getting more money than this department that has very effective programs and services that decrease crime? You know, it's just, it doesn't make sense why the, you know, people are kind of throwing their hands up and saying, no, it's just about, we need to protect the police.
Angela,
Yes.
I say it makes sense to me in that this is the Al McFarlane truism or proverb. We get the misery, they get the money. And so managing our misery is big business. And I say that basically from what I observe here in Minnesota, and that is the willingness to deny, to ignore, to underfund, to undercut, and to derail initiatives at equity and opportunity and solution making from our community. But as I say that, I have to always think twice, because I have to look at Atlanta, Kamal King, and look at DC, Brother James Wright, because maybe my argument doesn't hold up. Maybe in Atlanta, where we are the majority, or in DC, where we are the majority, I cannot make the same argument that the social structure is aligned, organized, institutionalized in a way that it continually deprives and exploits our misery, what they describe as deficits that describe our community. Kamal, what do you think?
No, it's the same. It's the same here. I don't think it matters with regard to majority minority. It's a effective policy that's carried out pervasively across the whole country. Same thing. One thing I wanted to say about having police live in the community, one of the problems that we're having in Atlanta is, and I'm sure this going across the whole country, is cities are becoming monetarily, what's the word? They're becoming monetarily too expensive for police officers and teachers, you know, so it's and that's a problem. You know, the police can't afford to live in Atlanta, in the city limits of Atlanta. are in DC unless you already have a home.
Yeah. Yes.
You know, I would just add to this conversation. Even if you have people who look like us in charge, if the system that they're
Right.
operating in
Right.
is problematic, then it really doesn't matter. You know, they just become conduits and complicit. And even though some maybe on an individual basis are able to navigate that and make some change, you know, it's still a system. So the system has to be deconstructed. And I would just say, to Angela's point, I think the Black press has a role to play in informing people about these disparities in funding. People don't know what they don't know. So, Angela, you have that back end information about the differences in funding, but that's not public knowledge necessarily. People don't know that. So, I think we have to get better at informing and exposing and letting people know what the differences are, so that when people go to vote, they can challenge, they can ask questions. We can protest for more money for different kinds of things. When people join these boards, these school boards, and politicians ask for a vote, we can say, well, how are you going to fund this office, which is about supporting people, as opposed to this office? And so I think we have to keep asking those questions, and it's an ongoing educational process.
Irma, let me pivot back with you to close the program out, talking about bell hooks. Transitioned into being an ancestor in the past day or so.
Well, you know, I'm the same age as she is, and to me, she died much too soon. And I remember bell hooks, of course, her writing, in which she really yielded words as if they were a sword. And someone talked about her precious pedagogy. She really inspired people with her ideas and her concepts. And in the poem that I wrote, I really tried to give homage to that. Part of why I am doing the Black Feminist Archive is because I want to make sure that people like bell hooks, who somehow got a little bit of due, but probably wasn't as well wide recognized as she should have been. I know that when I taught at the University of Florida, they wanted to recruit her, and the English department turned her down by saying that what she did wasn't real academic scholarship. Now we have places like Harvard giving courses on public scholarship. You know, but we have to remember is that people have said she was ahead of her time. I call her a truth sayer. I call her our Cassandra, who was in Greek mythology destined to tell the truth but never to be believed. And she was really a gentle spirit as well. And I think people need to understand that as penetrating as her critique was, she was also a Buddhist and someone who really believed not just in loving her own people, but in sharing that in a very broad sense. And so her voice will be missed.
Do you, can you share the poem you wrote? I think you published it today on...
I did publish it on Medium. I'm on my phone, so I don't know that I can get to it at the same time. So hopefully you'll reprint it.
I will, absolutely. Listen, with that, we're going to close today's program. I want to thank all of you. Thank you, Dr. Irma McFarlane. Thank you, Angela Rose Myers. Continued success in your work at the NAACP and as your studies continue in graduate school. James Wright, brother, a pleasure to be with you this morning early with Black Press USA and again today. And as always, Kamal King and I go back to third grade. And so this is just a wonderful relationship. It's so much fun to be with you. And when we have Dean Powell and Brenda, who I think is on the call, but in the workroom writing these stories, I'm so pleased to be with all of you. I thank you for listening, for watching. We'll see you next time. I'm Al McFarlane. Take care.